The sun hadn't yet broken over the eastern ridge when Thomas Brennan saw them. 400 warriors, maybe more, sitting perfectly still on their horses along the mesa above his small ranch. The morning mist clung to the valley floor, and through it he could see the silhouettes of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho riders, their presence as undeniable as the dawn itself. His hand didn't move toward the rifle leaning against the porch post. Instead, he simply nodded just once and waited. The question had been asked 3 weeks earlier in a Fort Laramie saloon that reeked of cheap whiskey and cheaper tobacco. Colonel Marcus Whitfield had cornered him there, surrounded by a dozen cavalry officers with eyes full of judgment and contempt. "You chose them over your own people, Brennan?" the colonel had asked, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. Thomas hadn't answered then. He'd simply finished his drink, set down the glass with deliberate care, and walked out into the Wyoming night. But the question had followed him home, echoing in his mind with every hoofbeat of his horse. Now, watching those 400 warriors in the growing light, Thomas knew the answer had arrived. He stepped off his porch, his weathered boots crunching on the frost-covered ground, and walked slowly toward the base of the mesa. He was 43 years old, a former cavalry scout with more years in the territory than most men had lived altogether, and he'd made his choice 6 months ago. A choice that had cost him everything he'd known and given him something he'd never expected to find. The warriors began to descend, not in a charge, not with weapons raised, but in a slow, deliberate procession that spoke of ceremony rather than confrontation. Thomas stood his ground, his hands visible and empty at his sides. The lead rider was a man he recognized immediately, even at a distance, Red Cloud himself, the Oglala Lakota chief whose reputation stretched from the Missouri River to the Rocky Mountains. Beside him rode Dull Knife of the Northern Cheyenne, and on the other side, Little Raven of the Arapaho. 3 nations united in purpose, coming to the home of a white man who'd been born in Pennsylvania and had worn the blue uniform of the United States Cavalry. The story of how Thomas Brennan had arrived at this moment began not in the American West, but in the green hills of his childhood, where his father had taught him a simple principle that would shape his entire life. Judge a man by his actions, Thomas, his father had said, not by the color of his skin or the language he speaks. Judge him by whether he keeps his word, whether he protects those weaker than himself, and whether he stands for what's right, even when it costs him everything. His father had been a minister, a man of God and principle, and he'd passed to the grave 8 years ago without knowing how deeply those words would take root in his son. Thomas had come west in 1854, young and full of the same ambitions that drew thousands to the territories. He'd signed on with the cavalry as a scout, using the tracking skills he'd learned from a Lenape elder back east who'd befriended his father. The army paid well, and Thomas had a natural talent for reading the land, for understanding the patterns of movement and survival that others missed. For 15 years he'd served faithfully, guiding patrols, preventing conflicts where he could, and fighting when he couldn't. He'd earned commendations, respect, and the trust of men on both sides of the endless tensions that defined the frontier. But trust is a fragile thing, and Thomas had watched it shatter in the winter of 1868. He'd been assigned to guide Colonel Whitfield's regiment to a Cheyenne village on the Washita River. They'd been told the village harbored warriors who'd raided settlements to the south. Thomas had his doubts. The tracks he'd seen suggested hunting parties, not war bands, but orders were orders, and he'd led the column through the November snow. What happened at dawn on that frozen riverbank had changed everything. The village had been sleeping when the cavalry attacked. Thomas had seen immediately what he'd feared. This was a peaceful camp, filled with elders, women, and children. He'd shouted for the colonel to hold fire, to verify the target, but his voice had been lost in the trumpet call to charge. The confrontation that followed lasted less than an hour, but its echoes would reverberate through Thomas's soul forever. When the gunsmoke cleared, over 100 people lay motionless in the snow, and fewer than 20 of them had been warriors of fighting age. Thomas had confronted Colonel Whitfield immediately after, his anger overcoming his military discipline. Those were innocent people, he'd said, his voice shaking with rage and grief. You didn't even try to verify, didn't even attempt to parley. You just eliminated them like they were animals." The colonel's response had been delivered with cold certainty. "They're all hostile, Brennan, every one of them. If you can't understand that, then you're no longer useful to the United States Army." Thomas had been dismissed from service that very day, his years of loyal work erased by his refusal to accept what he'd witnessed. For months afterward, Thomas had drifted. He'd tried to find work in various frontier towns, but word of his dismissal had spread, twisted and reshaped by those who had been there. In their version, Thomas Brennan had gone soft, had sided with the enemy, had become a traitor to his own kind. Doors closed. Old friends crossed the street to avoid him. He'd finally settled on an unclaimed piece of land in a remote valley, built a small cabin, and tried to make sense of a world that suddenly made no sense at all. The Lakota had found him in early spring. 3 young warriors had been tracking an elk when they'd spotted his cabin. Thomas had been outside, planting a small garden, when they'd approached. He'd recognized the tension in the moment, the potential for violence, but he'd also recognized something else, an opportunity to act on the principles his father had taught him. He'd raised his hands in peace, had gestured to his empty hands, and then to the deer meat drying on his rack. An offering, freely given, expecting nothing in return. The warriors had been suspicious at first, understandably so, but Thomas had persisted, using the limited hand signs he'd learned over his years as a scout, communicating respect and peaceful intent. They'd taken the meat and left, but something had shifted in that moment. Word spread through the Lakota camps of the white man in the valley who'd shown generosity without seeking advantage. In a time when every interaction between their peoples seemed to end in bloodshed and broken promises, Thomas's simple act of sharing had marked him as different. The visits had continued, slowly at first, then with increasing frequency. Warriors would stop by his cabin, sometimes to trade, sometimes simply to rest during their journeys. Thomas never turned anyone away. He shared what he had, learned more of the Lakota language, and listened to stories about their lives, their struggles, and their perspective on the conflicts that were tearing the territories apart. What he heard confirmed everything he'd already come to believe. The tribes weren't the mindless aggressors that army propaganda claimed. They were people fighting for their survival, defending their families and their way of life against an invasion that seemed to have no end. Then had come the day that changed everything, the day that would lead inevitably to this morning with 400 warriors on his doorstep. A young Lakota woman named Wakinyela, which meant Thunderbird Woman, had arrived at his cabin near death. She'd been escaping from a group of whiskey traders who'd attacked her village, vile men who preyed on the vulnerable and sold rot-gut alcohol that destroyed communities from within. She'd been wounded in the escape, a deep gash across her side that was already showing signs of infection. Thomas hadn't hesitated. He'd brought her inside, cleaned and dressed the wound with the medical knowledge he'd picked up in his Army years, and then stood guard over his cabin for 3 days while she recovered enough to be moved. The whiskey traders had tracked her to his valley, 4 rough men with the kind of cruelty that comes from knowing you're beyond the law's reach. They'd demanded he hand her over, called him a traitor, and worse, threatened to burn his cabin with both of them inside. Thomas Brennan had faced many dangers in his life, but he'd never been more certain of his purpose than in that moment. "You're not taking her," he'd said, his rifle held steady, and his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "You want her, you'll have to go through me first." The traders had been drunk and overconfident. They'd made their move, and Thomas had been forced to defend himself. When it was over, 3 of the traders were no longer breathing, and the 4th had fled on foot into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Wakinyela had recovered, and when she was strong enough, Thomas had helped her return to her people. The gratitude in her eyes had been profound, but it was nothing compared to the reaction of her father. Red Cloud himself had come to Thomas's cabin 2 weeks later, accompanied by a delegation of chiefs and warriors. Through an interpreter, the great leader had asked Thomas a simple question. Why did you risk your life for someone you did not know, someone of a people your own nation seeks to destroy? Thomas's answer had been equally simple. Because it was the right thing to do, because she needed help, and I could give it. Because the color of a person's skin doesn't determine the content of their character, and I'm tired of living in a world that pretends it does. Red Cloud had nodded slowly, and then he'd made an offer that Thomas never could have anticipated. You have shown honor when your people have shown none. You have chosen justice over loyalty to those who have abandoned justice. If you wish, you may live among us, not as a prisoner, not as an outsider, but as one who has earned respect through his actions." Thomas had accepted, not immediately, but after weeks of careful thought. He'd maintained his cabin, his small ranch in the valley, but he'd also begun spending time in the Lakota camps. He'd learned their language more fluently, had participated in their daily life, had come to understand their culture not as a curious observer, but as someone genuinely seeking to be part of their community. He'd taught them some of what he knew about cavalry tactics, information that could help them defend themselves more effectively. He'd also served as an intermediary when disputes arose with frontier settlers, using his unique position to broker peaceful solutions where both sides might have otherwise resorted to violence. The Army, predictably, had not taken this well. Colonel Whitfield had declared Thomas Brennan a traitor, an enemy of the United States, and a wanted man. Bounty hunters had come to the valley, professional trackers hired to bring him in, dead or alive, but they'd found the valley protected. Lakota scouts watched the approaches, and Thomas was never alone for long. The bounty hunters had either given up or, in 2 cases, had simply disappeared, their fate unknown and unlamented. It was this situation that had led to that confrontation in the Fort Laramie saloon 3 weeks ago. Thomas had gone to the fort under a flag of truce, hoping to negotiate a peaceful resolution to a dispute over grazing rights that threatened to spiral into open warfare. Colonel Whitfield had refused to even meet with him officially. Instead, he'd staged that public confrontation, surrounded Thomas with hostile officers, and asked that loaded question. "You chose them over your own people?" The question assumed so much. It assumed that shared skin color automatically meant shared values. It assumed that loyalty to a government, any government, was more important than loyalty to principles of justice and human dignity. It assumed that his people were defined by the nation of his birth, rather than by the community he'd chosen, and that had chosen him in return. Thomas hadn't answered in the saloon because any answer would have required hours of explanation, would have fallen on ears determined not to hear, would have been twisted into further proof of his betrayal. But now, watching Red Cloud and the other chiefs descend the mesa with 400 warriors behind them, Thomas understood that an answer was being given nonetheless, just not the answer Colonel Whitfield expected. The procession reached the valley floor and moved toward him in that same ceremonial pace. Thomas could see individual faces now, warriors he'd come to know over the past month. Standing Bear, who'd taught him the proper way to prepare buffalo hide. Swift Hawk, whose life Thomas had saved during a difficult river crossing. Little Wolf, whose 7-year-old son called Thomas Uncle in the Cheyenne tongue. Red Cloud reined his horse to a stop 10 feet from where Thomas stood. The chief was an imposing figure, even in his 60s, with eyes that seemed to see through pretense to the truth beneath. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the breathing of horses, the rustle of a morning breeze through the valley grass, and the distant call of a hawk riding the thermal currents above the mesa. Then Red Cloud raised his right hand, palm forward, in the traditional gesture of peaceful greeting. Thomas returned the gesture, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Red Cloud spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air, first in Lakota, then in the English he'd learned from missionaries decades ago. "Thomas Brennan, the question was asked of you. You chose them over your own people." The one who asked this question believed he knew the answer. He believed you had betrayed those who shared your birth. He believed you had become weak, had been deceived, had chosen the wrong side in a conflict that he sees as simple and clear. Red Cloud paused, his gaze never leaving Thomas's face. "But the question itself is flawed. It assumes there are 2 sides, us and them, red and white, savage and civilized. It assumes that a man cannot choose his people based on who shares his values rather than who shares his blood. It assumes that loyalty to injustice is somehow more honorable than opposition to injustice." The chief's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "We have brought 400 warriors to your home this morning, Thomas Brennan, not to threaten you, not to demand anything from you, but to answer that question in a way that cannot be misunderstood." Red Cloud turned in his saddle and gestured to the warriors behind him. As one, they began to dismount. Thomas watched in growing confusion as the warriors started unloading supplies from their pack horses, bundles of deer hide, dried meat, corn, beans, blankets, tools, and materials. Then Red Cloud spoke again, and understanding finally dawned. You asked the question that no one in your army dares to ask. You asked whether the orders you were given were just. You asked whether following those orders made you a good soldier or simply a good tool for evil men to use, and when you received your answer, you had the courage to act on it, even knowing what it would cost you. The chief dismounted and walked to stand face to face with Thomas. You chose to protect Joaquinilla when doing so meant becoming an enemy to your own nation. You chose to share your knowledge with us so that we might better defend our families. You chose to live by principles of justice and honor, even when your own people abandoned those principles. You did not choose them over your own people. You chose right over wrong. You chose justice over blind loyalty. And in doing so, you have become one of our people in the truest sense. Red Cloud placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture of profound respect. These 400 warriors have not come to threaten you. They have come to build. For the next 3 days, we will work together to expand your ranch, to build proper structures for storage and shelter, to help you create something that can sustain not just yourself, but others who might, like you, find themselves caught between two worlds. This is our answer to the question. You did not betray your people. You found your true people, and we honor you for it. The emotion that washed over Thomas in that moment was almost overwhelming. For months, he'd carried the weight of isolation, the pain of being called a traitor, the doubt that perhaps he'd made the wrong choice after all. But now, seeing 400 warriors who'd come not for vengeance, but for community, not to destroy, but to build, he understood something profound. Family isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the one you choose, or the one that chooses you, based on shared values and mutual respect. The next 3 days were unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. The warriors worked with astonishing efficiency and skill. They expanded his small cabin into a much larger structure, added a proper barn for horses and storage, built a smokehouse for preserving meat, and even constructed a small separate building that could serve as a meeting place. But more than the physical labor, it was the spirit of the work that moved Thomas most deeply. Warriors who'd been enemies of the United States Army just months ago worked side by side with a former cavalry scout, sharing jokes, stories, and meals. The barriers of language and culture didn't disappear, but they became permeable, less important than the shared purpose of creation. On the second day, as they were raising the frame for the barn, Standing Bear asked Thomas a question that many of the warriors had clearly been wondering about. Do you regret it? Leaving your army, your people, your old life? Do you wish you had stayed silent, followed orders, kept the life you had? Thomas paused in his work, considering his answer carefully. Around him, the construction noise quieted as others stopped to hear his response. I regret that the choice was necessary, Thomas said finally. I regret that my nation has pursued policies that force good men to choose between loyalty and justice. I regret the suffering that's been inflicted on innocent people in the name of manifest destiny and progress. But do I regret the choice itself? No, never. Because the alternative would have been to become someone I couldn't live with. The alternative would have been to prioritize comfort and acceptance over doing what I knew in my soul was right. My father taught me that a man is defined by his actions in the moments when doing right costs him everything. This was my moment, and I pray I'm worthy of the lesson he tried to teach me. Standing, Bear nodded slowly, then translated Thomas's words into Lakota for those who didn't speak English. A murmur of approval rippled through the gathered warriors. Then Standing Bear smiled, a genuine expression of warmth. Your father was wise. He would be proud to see who you have become. The work resumed, but something had shifted. The warriors no longer looked at Thomas as an outsider they'd chosen to help. They looked at him as one of their own, someone who'd proven himself through actions rather than words. That evening, as the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Red Cloud asked Thomas to join him on the mesa overlooking the ranch. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the camp below where warriors from 3 nations shared food and stories around several fires. Finally, the chief spoke. The world is changing, Thomas Brennan. The tide of white settlement cannot be stopped, no matter how bravely we fight. Within a generation, perhaps less, the life my people have known for countless generations will be gone. The buffalo will disappear. The open plains will be carved into farms and ranches. Our children will be forced to learn the white man's ways or perish. Thomas started to protest, to say that it didn't have to be that way, but Red Cloud raised a hand. I do not say this with anger or even sadness. It is simply the truth that we must face. But here is what I have come to understand. The future does not have to be one of total destruction. If there are more men like you, men who can see beyond the color of skin to the content of character, men who can build bridges instead of walls, then perhaps our people can survive the change. Not as we were, but as something new. Still ourselves, but adapted, evolved, strong in different ways. The chief turned to look directly at Thomas. This is why these 3 days matter. This is why 400 warriors came to build rather than to make war. We are showing our young men, and they will tell their children, that there is another path, that white and red can work together when justice and respect guide their actions, that choosing right over wrong is more important than choosing your tribe over another tribe. You are a symbol, Thomas Brennan, whether you wanted to be or not. You are proof that bridge building is possible, that principles matter more than prejudice. Thomas felt the weight of that responsibility, but also a sense of purpose he'd never quite felt before. What happens now, he asked. The Army still considers me a traitor. Colonel Whitfield will see this gathering as proof of my guilt, and there are settlers in the territory who will view any cooperation with the tribes as betrayal. Red Cloud nodded. Yes, the path ahead is dangerous. But I have a proposal. Your ranch sits in a valley that both our peoples pass through regularly. What if it became a place of neutral ground? A place where disputes could be brought for mediation before they become violence. A place where trading could happen fairly, where both sides could meet knowing they would be treated with respect and honesty. The idea took root in Thomas's mind immediately. A bridge, he said softly. Not just metaphorical, but literal. A place that connects, rather than divide. Red Cloud smiled. Exactly. It will not be easy. Both sides will accuse you of favoring the other. You will face threats and pressure from those who profit from conflict and division. But if you are willing, we will support you in this. We will spread the word among our people that your ranch is sacred ground, that violence there is forbidden, that you speak with our authority when you seek peaceful resolution. Thomas didn't need to think long about his answer. This was why he'd made his choice in the first place, not to simply avoid participating in injustice, but to actively work toward justice. I'm willing, he said. I'll do whatever I can to build that bridge, to create that neutral ground, even if it costs me everything I have left. Red Cloud clasped his forearm in the warrior's greeting of respect. You have already paid a great price, my friend, but I promise you this. You will never stand alone. When 400 warriors greet a man at dawn, they are saying he has earned the right to call them family. That bond does not break easily. The third day of construction ended with a ceremony that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. As the sun began to set, the warriors gathered in a circle around the newly expanded ranch. Red Cloud, Dull Knife, and Little Raven stood together, representing the 3 nations that had come. They called Thomas to the center of the circle, and Red Cloud spoke in a voice that carried to every person present. We give this man a name in our language. We call him Oyate Okichiapi, which means he who helps the people, not just our people or his people, but all people. He has shown us that the measure of a man is not his birth, but his choices. He has shown us that justice and honor can live in any heart that opens to them. Then, one by one, the warriors approached. Each one touched Thomas's shoulder or clasped his hand, acknowledging him as family, as one of their own. 400 warriors, each taking a moment to recognize his choice and to pledge their support. It took hours, and by the time the last warrior had offered his respect, full darkness had fallen, and the stars blazed overhead in that brilliant way they only do in remote places, far from civilization's lights. That night, around the fires, Thomas listened to the stories and songs of 3 nations. He didn't understand all the words, but he understood the meaning. These were stories of survival, of courage, of love for family and land. These were the songs that had sustained these people through generation after generation of hardship and struggle. And now, impossibly, he was part of that continuum. Not by birth, not by blood, but by choice, and by the recognition of others that his choice had been honorable. The warriors departed the next morning, heading back to their separate camps and the ongoing struggles of their existence. But they left behind more than just the expanded ranch. They left behind a sense of possibility, a living example that the conflicts tearing the territory apart weren't inevitable, weren't preordained by some cosmic law that different peoples must destroy each other. Red Cloud was the last to leave. He shook Thomas's hand in the white man's fashion, then clasped his forearm in the warrior's fashion, then finally embraced him as a father might embrace a son. "Remember," the chief said, "when the darkness comes, and it will come, remember this morning. Remember 400 warriors who came to build. Remember that you are not alone, and that choosing right over wrong is never a mistake, no matter what it costs." In the weeks that followed, word of what had happened spread throughout the territory. The reactions were predictably divided. Among the tribes, Thomas's reputation grew. More people began to stop at his ranch, seeking trade, seeking mediation in disputes, seeking simply a place where they could rest without fear. Some brought their children, wanting them to meet the white man who'd chosen honor over tribe, wanting them to see that not all white men were enemies. Thomas welcomed them all, shared what he had, and worked to earn the trust that had been placed in him. But among the white settlements, the reaction was largely hostile. Colonel Whitfield spread the story as proof of Thomas's betrayal, twisting the facts to make it sound like Thomas was planning an uprising, gathering warriors for an attack. Wanted posters appeared in frontier towns offering a substantial reward for Thomas Brennan, dead or alive, charged with treason and collaboration with hostile forces. Some settlers who'd known Thomas before defended him, but they were shouted down by those who saw any cooperation with the tribes as weakness or betrayal. The first real test of Thomas's new role came about 6 weeks after the warriors had departed. A young Cheyenne warrior named High Eagle had been accused of taking horses from a nearby settler's ranch. The settler, a man named Jackson, had gathered a group of armed men and was preparing to ride to the Cheyenne camp for revenge. Thomas heard about it through one of his regular visitors and immediately rode to intercept Jackson's group. He found them on the trail, 12 angry men with rifles and rope, determined to make an example. "Jackson," Thomas called out as he rode to block their path, "I heard about your horses, but you're about to make a mistake that will get people taken from life on both sides." Jackson, a hard man who'd fought in the Civil War before coming west, glared at Thomas with open hostility. "You got no business here, Brennan. Everyone knows you've gone native. Those animals took my property, and I aim to get it back." Thomas kept his voice calm but firm. "Those animals, as you call them, are people with families and children, and I happen to know that High Eagle was hunting in the opposite direction when your horses went missing. I saw him myself 2 days ago, 50 miles from your ranch." This gave Jackson pause. "How do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know you're not just covering for them?" Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Because I give you my word, and because if you ride into that camp with hostile intent, the warriors will defend themselves, and your men will not all come back. Is revenge for stolen horses worth the lives of your friends?" The standoff lasted several tense minutes. Thomas could see Jackson wavering, anger fighting with pragmatism. Finally, Thomas made an offer. "Come back to my ranch. Give me 2 days to investigate. I know trackers on both sides. If High Eagle took your horses, I'll help you get them back and ensure he faces consequences. If he didn't, we'll find out who did. But either way, we do this without bloodshed. You have my word on that, too." Jackson looked at his men, saw the uncertainty in some of their faces, and finally nodded. 2 days, Brennan. But if you're playing me, if this is some kind of trick, I'll see you hang alongside the thieves." Thomas spent the next day and a half investigating. He brought in Standing Bear, whose tracking skills were legendary, and together they followed the trail from Jackson's ranch. What they found surprised both of them. The tracks led not to any native camp, but to a canyon where a group of white outlaws had been hiding stolen livestock from multiple ranches. The outlaws had apparently been using attacks on settlements as cover, letting the settlers blame the tribes, while they built up their stolen herd for sale in distant markets. Thomas and Standing Bear watched the canyon through the night. counting at least 8 outlaws and over 40 horses, including Jackson's distinctive paint mare. At dawn, Thomas rode back to his ranch where Jackson was waiting impatiently. "Well?" the settler demanded. "Did your savage friend find my horses?" Thomas bit back his anger at the slur and instead focused on the facts. "Standing Bear found your horses. They're in Canyon Creek, about 10 miles west, being held by white outlaws, not Cheyenne warriors, 8 armed men. They've been using Indian raids as cover for their own theft." The revelation hit Jackson like a physical blow. He'd been so certain, so ready to believe the worst about the tribes, that the truth left him momentarily speechless. Thomas pressed his advantage. "You want your horses back? Then you gather your men. We'll gather some Cheyenne warriors who've been tracking these same outlaws for different thefts, and we'll handle this together. Show the territory that white and red can work together against the real enemies, the ones who profit from keeping us divided." Jackson struggled with it. Thomas could see the internal battle playing out on his face. Everything in the man's experience and prejudice told him that cooperating with Indians was wrong, was weakness, was betrayal. But he also wasn't stupid, and he could see the practical advantage of having experienced warriors on his side against 8 dangerous outlaws. Finally, grudgingly, he nodded. "All right, Brennan, we'll do it your way. But those warriors better know I'm not there to be friends. This is just business." The raid on Canyon Creek happened 2 days later, and it was a perfect example of what could be accomplished when prejudice was set aside for practical cooperation. Jackson's men approached from the east, while Standing Bear led Cheyenne warriors in from the west. The outlaws, caught by surprise and outnumbered, surrendered after only a brief exchange of fire that resulted in no serious injuries. The stolen horses were recovered and returned to their rightful owners, and most importantly, both white settlers and Cheyenne warriors saw firsthand that cooperation was not only possible, but effective. The success of the Canyon Creek raid began to shift perceptions, at least among some of the settlers in the region. Jackson, to his credit, told the story honestly in the surrounding settlements. Word spread that Thomas Brennan had been right, that rushing to judgment based on prejudice almost led to tragedy, and that working together had solved the problem without unnecessary bloodshed. It didn't convert everyone. Prejudice runs too deep for that, but it created cracks in the wall of certainty that separated the two communities. But if some settlers were beginning to see Thomas's value, Colonel Whitfield only grew more determined to stop him. The colonel saw Thomas not as a bridge builder, but as a threat to military authority, a living example that soldiers could choose conscience over orders. About 4 months after the 400 warriors had come to build, Whitfield made his move. He sent a company of cavalry to arrest Thomas on charges of treason, ordering them to use whatever force was necessary. The cavalry arrived at Thomas's ranch at midday. 40 soldiers led by a young lieutenant named Morrison, who looked distinctly uncomfortable with his orders. Thomas was working in his garden when they rode up, and he stood slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. "Lieutenant," he said calmly, "I'm going to guess you're here with arrest orders from Colonel Whitfield." Morrison nodded, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Thomas Brennan, you're under arrest for treason against the United States of America. The colonel wants you brought to Fort Laramie for trial. You can come peacefully, or we can make this difficult." Thomas considered his options. He could run, but that would only confirm the charges against him. He could fight, but he'd be outnumbered 40-1, and violence would destroy everything he'd been working to build. Or he could trust in the bonds he'd forged, the family he'd chosen, and the principles he'd committed himself to. "I'll come peacefully," he said, "but I need to send word to Red Cloud about what's happening. You can watch me do it. Make sure I'm not planning anything hostile." Morrison agreed, and Thomas wrote a brief note explaining the situation and asking that no violence be used in response to his arrest. He gave it to a young Lakota boy who'd been helping with chores, and the boy rode off toward the nearest Lakota camp. Then Thomas allowed himself to be shackled and placed on a horse. The cavalry began the journey back to Fort Laramie, and Thomas prayed that his message would arrive in time, and that the people he'd come to call family would honor his request for peace. The journey to Fort Laramie took 2 days. The cavalry was cautious, expecting ambush at any moment, but none came. Thomas spent the time talking with Lieutenant Morrison, learning that the young officer had serious doubts about the orders he'd been given. "I read your service record," Morrison said quietly on the second night, when they were far enough from the other soldiers to speak privately. 15 years of exemplary service, multiple commendations. You saved the lives of 3 different patrol groups. That's not the record of a traitor. Thomas appreciated the lieutenant's willingness to question orders, something that had cost Thomas everything, but that he still believed was essential to being a truly good soldier. Then why are you following this order? He asked. Morrison looked troubled. Because I don't know what else to do. The colonel says you're providing intelligence to hostile forces, helping them attack settlers and evade the army. He says you've chosen to become the enemy. But everything I've heard about you since we arrived in this region suggests something different. What have you heard? Thomas asked. Morrison smiled slightly. That you mediate disputes. That you've prevented violence more times than anyone can count. That you've helped return stolen property to both settlers and tribes. That you're building something new, something that might actually bring peace to this region. So either you're the most clever traitor in history using peacemaking as cover for hostile action, or Colonel Whitfield is wrong about you. The young officer met Thomas's eyes. I'm starting to think it's the latter. They arrived at Fort Laramie on the evening of the second day. Thomas was taken directly to the stockade, a small stone building with iron bars on the windows. As he was locked inside, Thomas noticed something that gave him a spark of hope. Standing on the bluffs surrounding the fort were hundreds of warriors, watching silently. They weren't attacking, weren't making any hostile moves, but their presence was unmistakable. The message was clear. Thomas Brennan was not alone, and his fate mattered to many people. Colonel Whitfield noticed them too, and Thomas could see the fury in the older man's face as he strode across the parade ground to the stockade. You see what you've done? Whitfield shouted through the bars. You've brought hundreds of hostiles to our doorstep. You've given them intelligence about our defenses, our patrol patterns, our strength. You're not just a traitor, Brennan. You're the most dangerous kind of traitor because you genuinely believe you're doing the right thing. Thomas stood and walked to the bars, meeting the colonel's gaze without flinching. They're here because they know the charges against me are false. They're here because they're my family now, chosen family, and family doesn't abandon each other. But notice, Colonel, they're not attacking. They're not firing arrows or charging the walls. They're simply bearing witness. Because I asked them to respond to injustice with peaceful strength rather than violence. Does that sound like the action of someone providing intelligence for hostile attacks? Whitfield's face reddened with anger. You're a traitor and a fool. You think you can bridge the gap between civilization and savagery? You think your naive idealism can change the fundamental nature of this conflict? The Indians are doomed, Brennan. Our nation's expansion is inevitable. All you're doing is prolonging their suffering and endangering white settlers in the process. Thomas felt a deep sadness at the colonel's words, not for himself, but for the waste of it all. You're right that change is coming, he said quietly. But it doesn't have to come through complete destruction. It doesn't have to mean the elimination of everyone who was here first. If we have the courage to see each other as human beings rather than obstacles, we could build something better than either culture alone. The colonel turned and walked away, shouting orders for increased guard patrols and defensive preparations. That night, Thomas sat in his cell, uncertain about what the next day would bring. He'd been charged with treason, which carried the penalty of being removed from life. Whitfield clearly wanted to make an example of him, to show anyone else who might consider conscience over orders what the consequences would be. But Thomas also knew that his trial, if there was one, would be complicated by the presence of hundreds of witnesses on the bluffs, and by the support he'd garnered among at least some of the settlers. Morning came, and with it a surprise. Lieutenant Morrison appeared at Thomas's cell, accompanied by 2 other soldiers. Mr. Brennan, the lieutenant said formally, I've been speaking with the other officers. Several of us believe that the charges against you are unjust and that this trial will be a miscarriage of justice. We're prepared to testify on your behalf, to explain what we've witnessed of your actions and the results those actions have achieved. Thomas felt gratitude wash over him. Thank you, Lieutenant. That means more than you know, but you realize this could cost you your career? Morrison smiled. Maybe. But you taught me something, Mr. Brennan, even if you didn't know you were teaching it. You taught me that some things are more important than career advancement. Some things are more important than following orders. Justice is one of those things, and if I have to sacrifice my career to stand up for justice, then maybe I'm finally becoming the kind of officer I've always wanted to be." The young man's words echoed Thomas's father's teachings so perfectly that Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. The trial began at noon. It was held in the fort's main hall, with Colonel Whitfield acting as both prosecutor and military judge, which Thomas knew was already a violation of military justice, but which he couldn't effectively challenge. Whitfield laid out his charges in dramatic fashion, painting Thomas as a mastermind of Indian resistance, a traitor who'd provided intelligence that led to multiple settler casualties, and a man who'd actively worked to undermine United States military operation. The charges were largely fabricated, based on circumstantial evidence and deliberate misrepresentation of Thomas's peacemaking efforts. Then it was time for Thomas to respond. He stood, still shackled, and spoke clearly enough for everyone in the crowded room to hear. "Colonel Whitfield has accused me of choosing them over my own people. It's the same question he asked me in a saloon 3 weeks ago, and it's the same question that underlies all these charges. But the question itself reveals the fundamental flaw in his thinking. He assumes that my people are defined by the color of my skin rather than by the values I hold. He assumes that loyalty to a government policy, any policy, is more important than loyalty to principles of justice and human dignity." Thomas paused, looking around the room at the assembled soldiers and officers. "I've spent 15 years serving the United States Army faithfully. I've guided patrols, prevented violence where possible, and fought when necessary. But I will not participate in the slaughter of innocent people. I will not follow orders that violate every principle of justice and humanity that our nation claims to stand for. And when I was dismissed from service for refusing to accept such orders, I made a choice. I chose to continue working for peace, to build bridges instead of walls, to prove that white and red can coexist with mutual respect." He could see that his words were having an impact on at least some of those present. "The 400 warriors who came to my ranch didn't come to plan attacks. They came to build. They expanded my ranch, created structures for peaceful trading and mediation. They came to show their young men that another path is possible, that justice and honor matter more than racial loyalty. And in the months since, I've helped prevent violence dozens of times, recovered stolen property for both settlers and tribes, and created neutral ground where disputes can be resolved without bloodshed." Colonel Whitfield interrupted angrily. "He admits it. He admits working with the enemy, providing them aid and support." But Lieutenant Morrison stood up, his voice clear and firm. "Colonel, permission to speak." Whitfield glared at the young officer, but couldn't refuse without making the trial appear even more unfair than it already was. "Speak, then," Morrison addressed the room, rather than just the colonel. "I've investigated Thomas Brennan's actions since coming to this region. I've spoken with settlers, with other soldiers, with everyone I could find who had direct knowledge of what he's actually done. And here's what I found. He's prevented at least 15 conflicts that would have resulted in casualties on both sides. He's helped recover stolen livestock from white outlaws who were using Indian raids as cover. He's mediated property disputes, trading disagreements, and cultural misunderstandings. The settlers in his region are safer because of his work, not endangered by it." Other officers began to speak up, corroborating Morrison's findings. The tide in the room was shifting, and Whitfield could feel his case unraveling. In desperation, the colonel played his final card. "The man is charged with treason. The penalty is the ultimate removal. The evidence shows he's aided the enemy. This court finds him guilty." But before he could pronounce sentence, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. The doors to the hall burst open, and a civilian entered, a well-dressed man with the bearing of someone used to authority. "I am Judge Henry Palmer, Federal Circuit Court," the man announced. "I've ridden 3 days from my court in Colorado Territory because I received word of a military trial being conducted in violation of several federal statutes. Mr. Brennan is a civilian discharged from military service. He has the right to a civilian trial with proper legal representation and a jury of his peers. This military tribunal has no jurisdiction over him." Colonel Whitfield looked like he'd been struck. "This is Army business on an Army post. We have jurisdiction." Judge Palmer shook his head. "Not over a civilian charged with civilian crimes. Even if the crimes relate to military matters, the defendant has the right to a proper civilian trial." unless you'd like your entire case thrown out and yourself brought up on charges for violating federal law, you'll release Mr. Brennan into my custody immediately." The room erupted in argument, but in the end, federal law prevailed. Thomas was released from his shackles and placed in Judge Palmer's custody. As they left the fort, Thomas asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Who sent for you, Judge?" Palmer smiled. "I received letters from several sources. Lieutenant Morrison wrote to me explaining the situation. But I also received a letter signed by 15 prominent settlers in your region, vouching for your character and describing your work. And most interestingly, I received a letter from Red Cloud himself, dictated to a missionary and explaining in quite eloquent terms why your work was essential to peace in the territory. I don't know if I've ever seen such a diverse group of people, all united in support of one individual. The civilian trial took 3 months to convene, and when it finally did, it became something of a sensation in the territories." Thomas was defended by a skilled attorney from Denver, who argued that his actions, far from constituting treason, were precisely the kind of bridge building that official government policy claimed to support. Witness after witness testified to the lives saved, the conflicts prevented, and the peace maintained through Thomas's efforts. Even some military officers, inspired by Lieutenant Morrison's courage, testified honestly about what they had observed. The prosecution tried to argue that any cooperation with tribes was inherently treasonous, but Judge Palmer shut down that argument firmly. "Treason requires hostile intent against the United States," he instructed the jury. "Mr. Brennan's actions show no such intent. He has worked to prevent violence, to create peaceful coexistence, and to uphold principles of justice that the United States claims as its foundation. You cannot convict a man of treason for being better at upholding American values than the government itself." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty on all charges. When the verdict was read, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in nearly 2 years. Hope. Hope that justice could still prevail. Hope that principles mattered more than prejudice. Hope that the bridge he was trying to build might actually succeed. As he walked out of the courtroom a free man, he was greeted by a crowd that included settlers, tribal members, soldiers, and civilians, all united in celebration of the verdict. Red Cloud was waiting outside, having maintained a peaceful vigil throughout the trial. The chief clasped Thomas's arm in the warrior's greeting. "Justice was done today," Red Cloud said. "Not the kind of justice that comes from the end of a rifle, but the true justice that comes from courage and principle. You asked us to respond with peaceful strength rather than violence, and we honored your request. Today, we see that the choice was right." Thomas nodded, deeply moved. "Thank you. Thank you for believing in me, for supporting me, for showing that there's another way." The chief smiled. "We did not give you that gift. You gave it to us. You showed us that not all white men value conquest over justice. You showed us that bridge building is possible if someone has the courage to stand in the middle, bearing the weight from both sides. You chose right over wrong, family over tribe, justice over loyalty. The question they asked you, you chose them over your own people, has been answered. You chose all people over the hatred that divides them. And 400 warriors came to your home at dawn, not to threaten, but to honor that choice." Thomas Brennan returned to his ranch in the valley, to the neutral ground he'd worked so hard to create. The trial had made him something of a reluctant celebrity, a symbol of the possibility of coexistence in a region torn by conflict. Over the coming years, his ranch would become a recognized neutral zone where disputes were mediated, where fair trading occurred, where children from both cultures learned to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice and violence continued to plague the territories, but it was proof that another way was possible. Lieutenant Morrison was promoted and transferred to a different post, where he continued to serve with honor while never forgetting the lesson Thomas had taught him about the importance of conscience over blind obedience. Colonel Whitfield was eventually forced into retirement after an investigation into his conduct during Thomas's case revealed multiple violations of military justice. Judge Palmer went on to hear many more cases involving the complex legal issues of frontier justice, always guided by the principle that law should serve justice rather than prejudice. And the 400 warriors who'd come to build? They returned to their camps and their lives, but they carried with them a story that would be told around around fires for generations. The story of the white man who chose honor over tribe, who stood in the middle bearing the weight from both sides, who proved that family is defined by values rather than blood. The story of the morning when 400 warriors came not to fight, but to build, not to destroy, but to honor, not to answer hatred with hatred, but to answer a question with a demonstration of what true loyalty looks like. In the end, the question, "You chose them over your own people?" was answered not with words, but with actions. Thomas Brennan chose justice over injustice. He chose family over tribal loyalty. He chose to stand for principles even when it cost him everything he'd known. And in doing so, he found his true people, the ones who valued courage, honor, and justice above the accident of birth or the color of skin. The warriors who greeted him at dawn came not as enemies, but as family, and that made all the difference.